All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to Praxis 1113. One of the most important and impactful forms of political protest, of political praxis this decade, has been the Assembly. From Tahrir Square in Cairo in January 2011 to the Puerto del Sol Square in Madrid in May 2011, with the emergence of the Indignados movement, to Zuccotti Park here in downtown New York in September 2011, and the birth of the Occupy Wall Street movement and the global Occupy movement, to Taksim Gezi Park in Istanbul in May 2013, and Nuit Debout in Paris in March 2016, and possibly still today, as we speak, with the ongoing protests and assemblies in Algiers that are there to oust President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, and the Rassemblement de Gilets Jaunes at roundabouts across France. We've seen really a remarkable set of assemblies as a form of praxis. And many political concepts have been born or reborn through these assemblies during this decade. Notions of leaderlessness, which has been hotly debated, voice and collective speech, questions of political disobedience or civil disobedience, many questions of inclusion and exclusion, and of course the questions of the use of nonviolence or violence. The form of the Assembly has been theorized now from several different angles. Michael Hart and Tony Negri, in their 2017 book, Assembly, approach it from the perspective of the multitude, and they promote the Assembly as a promising mode for revolution. Tom Mitchell and Mick Taussig approach it through the lens of political disobedience or disobedience, and also are somewhat enthusiastic about its potential. And of course, Judith Butler, in her book, Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, which will be our grounding space, intellectual space, to start the conversation, approaches it from the angle of a theory of performativity. It's there that we're going to start today, using Butler's notes to launch our discussion, but also to have a broad discussion of assembly. The posts by our guests, as you have seen, raise a number of important questions for our discussion. First, are we past the age of assembly, or has assembly been co-opted, say, by the new right today? Second, how does the assembly invoke a people, or relate to, or depend on, or contest a democratic theory and democratic assumptions? And also, how does it relate to the very question of left populism that we explored at Praxis 913? Third, what place for vulnerability and precarity in the form of assembly? What is the place also of aesthetic representation, something that Marianne Hirsch will discuss and has discussed in her post? What is the place for nonviolence and for violence? And then more broadly, how do we ethically engage the other in these forms of assembly, the other who may possibly want our own demise? So to help us through these questions, I'm delighted to welcome four brilliant critical theorists who will start off the discussion, and as you know, you've read their posts, have a lot to say and to contribute to this. We're going to start with Robin Celikates, who joins us from Amsterdam via Princeton. Robin is a professor of political and social philosophy at the University of Amsterdam, specializing in critical theory, civil disobedience, democracy, collective action, recognition, and citizenship. And this year he's a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, where he's working on a book that develops a critical theory of democratizing disobedience. He's the author of Critique as Social Practice, Critical Theory and Social Understanding from 2018, and co-editor of Transformations of Democracy, Crisis, Protest, and Legitimation in 2015. So welcome back. Robin was here a few years ago as a visiting scholar at Columbia, so we're really glad to have you back. After Robin, we'll hear from Joshua Clover, Joshua Clover is professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Davis, where he specializes in critical theory, Marxism, political theory, political economy, poetry, and poetics. His research and scholarship in these areas is informed by his interest in social movements. His most recent book is Riot, Strike, Riot, which came out in Verso in 2016, and which in part we'll return to later on in Praxis 1313 to discuss. He also, his writings also include publications in books of poetry, most recently Red Epic, and he's also affiliated with the Film Studies and the Mellon Research Initiative in Racial Capitalism at Davis. So we're delighted to have you, Joshua, with us. After, we will then hear from Professor Marianne Hirsch, our own, who is the William Peterfield Trent Professor of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia University, and professor in the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. And Professor Hirsch's work combines feminist theory with memory studies, the transmission of memories of violence across generations, and in her most recent book, The Generation of Post-Memory, Writings and Visual Culture After the Holocaust, she argues that memories of traumatic events live on to mark the lives of those who are not there to experience them. She has many other books, Ghosts of Home, The Afterlife of Chernovitz in Jewish Memory, and Rites of Return, for instance, co-edited with Nancy Miller. So we're delighted that Marianne Hirsch will be presenting on the panel as well. And then we are delighted to welcome back to Columbia Nandini Sundar, who was here many years doing her PhD in anthropology, and who's a professor of sociology now at the Delhi School of Economics. In addition to researching political sociology, law, and inequality, Nandini Sundar is an outspoken human rights activist in India. Her most recent book, The Burning Forest, India's War Against the Maoists, which came out with Verso in 2019, is an empathetic, moving account of what drives indigenous peasants to support armed struggle despite severe state repression, including lives lost, homes, and communities destroyed. And her recent publications also include The Scheduled Tribes in Their India, The Burning Forests, India's War in Bastar. So we've got a terrific panel. We also have a terrific group. We're all of us in the room, and I'm delighted. Professor Thomas Dodman from the French department is going to kick off some of the remarks. And his book, his first book was called What Nostalgia Was, War, Empire, and the Time of a Deadly Emotion. And so we're thrilled that Thomas will kick us off, but I'm also thrilled that everyone is here, graduate students, Professor David Lelyveld and Jack Halberstam and Bruno Bastiles. So everyone here. Robin, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks so much for the invitation and for organizing this whole series, which is really a fantastic forum for discussing, well, theory and practice and what is to be done today. So, as a starting point, both of the blog post that I shared with you and of my remarks tonight, I sort of took what I thought was maybe not really attention, but 2 points in Butler's very impressive and important book that I'm not entirely sure how to relate to each other. So one is the kind of emphasis on the essential contestability and openness, on the internal fragmentation and heterogeneity of all constructions of the demos or of the people, of any kind of we that is invoked in politics. The need for having a kind of check on mechanisms of reflexivity that address the tendencies to exclusion and to marginalization that seem to be built in the invocation of such, we or the demos on the one hand, and on the other, some of the remarks that Butler makes on the unavoidability of, in a way, engaging the logic of hegemonic claim making, of simply claiming a we, in a way without further problematization, as it were, the we of the people, maybe even, or as she sometimes also says, the real people that gets invoked against, the elite, etc. My worry, in a way, was what to make of the relation between these two aspects that I find extremely interesting in Butler's text. The worry is basically whether, in her analysis, ultimately there is a way to distinguish the struggles for hegemony. We want to use that vocabulary, or maybe the struggles for emancipation from the left, as it were, not only qua sort of substantial aims they might be directed to, but also in terms of their form, from struggles for hegemony from the right. So do they ultimately have the same political form or follow the same political logic? Because at the face of it, it seems that many of the movements that Butler is talking about, so the sort of practices of assembly that she highlights, and the the movements of the square that she invokes as examples, that they have struggled quite a lot with the relation between these two aspects, and they, in a way, have been, I mean, the whole debate about prefiguration would be one way into this question. I mean, they have tried to develop, let's say, forms of politics, of assembling, that precisely don't fall into the same logic of hegemonic identity construction that you find in the political field at large, and especially in a kind of unproblematic form on the right, where the construction of a homogeneous sort of collective subject that serves as the firm ground of effective identification and mobilization is sort of embraced as a necessity, but probably also as something that is simply taken to be unproblematic. And my starting question, in a way, would simply be whether that is really a model that we can use to both figure out what the political specificity of that form of assembling is that Butler focuses on, and also when we have to think today about how a new kind of emancipatory reaction would look in the face of sort of what is sometimes called right-wing populism. And in a way that also connects back to the last session you had here on what left populism is or could be, and whether such a term even makes sense. I mean, in a way, the subtext of my remarks is that this might be a contradictory project. At least I'm very skeptical with regard to the ability to sort of separate the kind of leftist emancipatory potential of the politics of prefiguration from the kind of essentializing pull of any populist or hegemonic project. And what makes me a bit nervous about the way in which Chantal Mouffe addresses that, it's not really something that Butler does in the same way, is that, at least in Mouffe's own project, it seems to be in a way enough that the theorist in a way knows that it's an anti-essentialist project. You can't really construct the people as something that is homogeneous, really out there, etc. But she doesn't seem to be very worried about the fact that actually existing left populist movements precisely fall into this kind of essentializing trap themselves, including the ones like France Insoumise and so on, which she sort of gives a positive spin to. So that's the kind of worry that is in the background. And I thought that actually, if you go back to the earlier discussion that Butler had with Laclau and Zizek in contingency, universality, hegemony, or whatever the precise order of these terms is in the book's title, this book from 2000 where they had a debate with each other, I thought it's really important that Butler in that debate sort of criticizes Laclau's notion of constructing a chain of equivalences in a too simplistic manner, and contrasts that with the need for what she calls then a kind of politics of translation that keeps the kind of heterogeneity of the claims and the fact that they are only sort of partially translatable into a shared signifier, present and open. So that seemed to me a very important moment that is not as present in the current book as it was back then. Now, in my remarks here, I just want to maybe say a bit more about two aspects that one of them I mentioned in the blog post, the other one came to mind also thanks to Joshua's blog post. The first one, in a way, I just want to go back to the two examples that I named for contemporary struggles that seem to me a kind of better way into understanding how contestations also of the we could be understood that don't necessarily fall into the hegemonic logic of constructing the real people in a way, but rather problematize these attempts. So two things that I wanted to mention here. One is, I named them briefly in the post. I mean, one is the example of indigenous struggles or struggles of First Nations who do not really aspire to become part of the we, nor do they aspire to to say, well, we are the real people and you guys are something else. But rather, I think the logic of their claims is to deeply unsettle this whole idea that you could have a kind of homogeneous political space that is occupied by one homogeneous we, and to, in a way, sort of push for a deep pluralization of, the notion of peoplehood, of peoples, always in the plural, etc., etc. And that would, for sure, require a more fundamental sort of revision of what the space of the political is than Mouffe, but maybe also Butler, at least in this book, seem to allow for when they sort of refer to the unavoidable logic of hegemonic constructions of we the people. Another example that I've worked on myself a bit are current migrant and refugee struggles, where insofar as the we is invoked, it is not necessarily invoked in the same logic that Butler seems to highlight. So in Amsterdam, where I work, there's a very strong refugee movement, which simply has the name We Are Here. And that's not meant as you are here and you say we and we are here, so we just want to be part of that we, but in a way it's the invocation of the we and of the presence of that we that is supposed to precisely unsettle the two boundaries of the community that are usually taken for granted, which are the kind of territorial boundaries that keep, seek to keep migrants out, make them drown, especially in the Mediterranean, etc., etc., and only let some through. But also the internal boundaries of membership, so who gets to be part of the demos. Obviously not everyone who's on the territory of the state. And in my view, in a way, these are the much more productive political moments where hegemonic constructions of the we get displaced without necessarily another hegemonic claim to a new we that is more encompassing taking their place. Now, I don't want to claim that this is the only kind of model or the best model for emancipatory politics, but I do think that without this kind of problematizing, in a way, negative or negativistic intervention, and without the left paying a lot of attention to these kinds of interventions, there is really a danger of falling into the same kind of hegemonic traps that then make it so difficult to say how exactly we want to distinguish the assemblies that Butler is talking about, or the assemblies, counter-assemblies, as Nandini calls them, that the right is organizing today. I think it would be too simplistic to think we can only distinguish them in terms of their aims or their visions of the political community. Surely that's an important point, and I think it's very good that liberals come out and sort of denounce the bad aims of these movements, but I think there's a deeper level at which we should also look at and criticize the precise form of politics that they manifest, because I think it's really different from the form of politics that we find in the square movements and the assemblies that Butler is talking about. The second point I just briefly want to make, and hopefully that's something we can come back to, is the idea of nonviolence that Butler evokes towards the end of her book, where on page 187 she refers to the principles of nonviolence and says that there's an important place for principled embodied acts of nonviolence in the encounter with violence, and those acts must define any movement seeking to defend the rights of public assembly. And she says a few things about how that nonviolence is both a radical ethos but also a tactic that has to be employed in particular historical and political conjunctures. And I agree with that. But at the same time, I think, in a way, we have to say more, hopefully together with Butler, and she did a bit. She did say a bit more in the tenor lectures she gave in 2016, the second of which was called The Ethics and Politics of Nonviolence. But I think she still, in a way, leaves a problematic part of the whole discourse of nonviolence untouched, namely the fact that it's an extremely flexible discourse, and one that is usually invoked not from within movements, in a question of, okay, what are the means that this movement wants to employ, what is kind of the problematic logic of violence that we might have to problematize from within the movement, but usually it's a kind of sort of top-down state discourse in which nonviolence is extremely selectively invoked to delegitimize all kinds of more confrontational movements and politics that the state is confronted with. So it's usually the critique of insurrectionary violence, you might say. Think of the so-called London riots, and already the whole language of riots is one that we should talk about here, because it does tend to have a depoliticizing effect, at least in the way in which it is used in the broader public, the Paris banlieue, and other examples where nonviolence usually is usually linked with highly idealized versions of movement politics from the past. So there's a great article by a scholar called Theo Harris, who just wrote also a very good book on the civil rights movement, which is, the article is called Martin Luther King Never Occupied a Freeway, and several other myths about the civil rights movement that are today invoked to delegitimize Black Lives Matter. So there are all these idealizing constructions of past movements that were in their own day constructed as uncivil, violent, etc., that now today serve to denounce movements that are on a spectrum, right, and where you can't simply say that they're violent or non-violent, but they employ a diversity of tactics and often have very complex and politically contested discussions within the movements about how to evaluate these tactics. And I think it's really important if we want to sort of highlight the radical potential of nonviolence to take these debates seriously and to respond to them. And I think well, my time is up, that's what this says. But the last point I want to make is simply that Butler, I think, opens up the space for asking these questions, but she does not yet, at least in this book and in the tenor lectures, really address them in the way in which I think we have to address them. So probably I would, in the end, think that Etienne Balibar is quite right in saying that we can neither embrace sort of violence unproblematically, because we don't even know what that would mean in a way, neither conceptually nor politically, but for the same reasons, it's also not possible to simply proclaim nonviolence as the principle all movements have to subscribe to, and we can maybe go into the details of why that is such a complicated, messy question later. So.
Thank you, Robin. And I think actually that's probably a great segue to Joshua Clover.
Yeah, I think you'll definitely hear some overlap, although not identicality. I think, and thank you all for being here so that we can think together. You know, my initial blog post concerned two questions, and one that was asked in the book regarding the composition problem, or how to develop a potentially adequate political aggregate, and one question unasked, which is whether democracy is an unchallengeable transcendental horizon, or whether it's a concrete historical phenomenon that might need to be addressed and possibly overcome. And from those, I've developed two further questions that come up repeatedly in the book, one regarding the public-private divide, and the other regarding the question of nonviolence as it's raised. There's a lot of worrying over the public-private distinction as regards the assembly in the book. To quote, I'm going to quote the book several times. We were asked not to do book reports, but I'm an English professor. They trained me to stay with the text, so you'll forgive me, I hope. So the book says, time and again, mass demonstrations take place on the street, in the square. It sort of sets forth the book's geography. And the assembly in the square is then tested against the public-private distinction drawn from Arendt, a distinction that's both accepted and troubled. That is, it is accepted as a fundamental political axis and terrain of struggle. Again, I quote, "We miss something of the point of these public demonstrations if we fail to see that the very public character of the space is being disputed, even fought over, when these crowds gather." At the same time, in the book's care-filled disclosure of abstract and concrete interdependence and mutual implication, we're reminded that this opposition is problematically ideological and moreover cannot hold. We're reminded that, quote, "this view of the foreign, unskilled, feminized body that belongs to the private sphere is the condition of possibility for the speaking male citizen who is presumably fed by someone and sheltered somewhere, and whose nourishment and shelter are tended to in some regular ways by some disenfranchised population or another." Now, I note here the echo, neither the first nor the last, of the Italian Marxist feminists, who discerned that the unwaged and unrecognized reproductive labor of the private sphere formed the necessary basis for the production of surplus value in the workplace, despite appearing to be private and interior to exploitation. An approach that takes the real of this structure to be accumulation of capital rather than speech. Once this question of political economy is raised, it becomes clear that the largely political account of the public-private distinction is inadequate and cannot tell us everything we need to know about the particularity of the square and its assemblies. I suspect that one of the reasons that public-private keeps not working in the book is because the book offers us a one-sided account of the square in the first place. It's worth recalling that the square, reaching back to the agora in Greece, has two historical functions, as a political and a commercial space. That's why there's two Greek verbs, both drawn from agora, right? One of which means I speak in public, and one of which means I shop. And those index the history of what actually happens in the square. Even before we consider the domestic sphere away from the square, or the home, or the regime of reproductive labor, the square is already both public and private, political and economic. And that for the moment we cannot extract, or have so far not extracted, one from the other. Once we grasp this, we might offer a somewhat alternate account of assembly in the square. That it does not arise anymore from the desire or necessity of the political expression or speech or appearance than it does from the condition of market dependency, from being excluded from the places of conventional production and left to the spaces given over to and commanded by the forces of circulation, exchange, consumption, and so on. Political economy and its transformations over the last 100 years have driven social movements into the square at least as much as the square has been selected as some proper political place. And we miss that at our peril, and without that dimension, we can't answer the question, which I think you raised, of why exactly people keep ending up in the square in the form of assembly after 1989, right? Tiananmen Square really indicates the beginning of this convention on the international stage. It's not simply a transcendental historical feature, and we have to ask ourselves, what are the developing historical forces that drive populations into that space? Now, here I take a sharp turn, but not an unmotivated one. I suspect that the circumnavigation of the political economic toward the shores of the more purely political, toward the undebated horizon of an idealized democracy, conditions the book's certainty that politics is always already a matter of appearance, expression, and speech. And I suspect in turn that this provides the framework for the book's insistence on, quote, our ability to name nonviolent action in the context of democratic struggles. My strong view, the book says, is that assemblies of this kind can succeed only if they subscribe to principles of nonviolence. There's much to be said on this topic, some of which we've already heard. What I do not want to say, at least for now, is whether I think that is a useful or less than useful strategic prescription, whether or not it is ethically defensible, and so on. Perhaps that will come up in our conversation. For now, I want to pause over what was, for me, by far the most puzzling aspect of the book, which concerns exactly what it names as nonviolent action in the first place. I hope you'll forgive me for quoting one passage at length now. But one might consider, well, tactics like strikes, hunger strikes in prison, work stoppages, nonviolent forms of occupying governments or official buildings or spaces whose private status is being contested, or boycotts of various kinds, including consumer and cultural boycotts, sanctions, but also public assemblies, petitions, ways of refusing to recognize illegitimate authority, declining to vacate institutions that have illegitimately been closed. What tends to unify such actions, so that's our list of nonviolent actions. What tends to unify such actions or inactions, depending on your interpretation, is that they all call into question the legitimacy of a set of policies or actions or the legitimacy of a specific form of rule. End of passage. So the first oddity here, and it's repeated elsewhere in the book, is that, just to choose an example from that list, strikes are understood as nonviolent, which will come as a tremendous shock to the textile workers of Lyon, or the coal miners in Colorado, or any striker who's ever stopped a scab from entering a factory, or the vast history of extraordinary violence that attends strikes. It's utterly baffling to me how that could be posed as a nonviolent activity. I understand there's an ideology of strike, but that's quite different from the lived history, which the labor movement has gone through. This will not be the only time the book appropriates violent struggle for the ideal of nonviolence. Elsewhere, it does the same for Ferguson, Missouri, for Tahrir Square, foundational for the book. Regarding the former, I'm happy to tell you I was in Ferguson after Michael Brown was killed. By some measures, the longest riot in U.S. history. It was distinguished precisely by the seriousness of the counterattack up to and including people shooting back at the cops. As for the latter, Tahrir Square, you can really just look at YouTube to see, for example, the battles for control over the 6th of October bridge leading away from the square, between the army and the protesters, January 25th, 2011, which featured on the side of the protesters throwing rocks and bottles, driving improvised wedges into the police lines, the fact that revolutionists tend to have less advanced weapons than the military should not be the occasion to misrecognize the character of such confrontations. So this is one oddity, which is the empirical misrecognition. The other oddity, returning to the book's claim that these purportedly nonviolent forms of protest, quote, all call into action the legitimacy of a set of policies or actions, is how studiously this avoids mention of what is arguably the most significant arrogation of legitimacy on the state's part, the famed monopoly of violence that Weber identifies with state formation itself. To quote again, of course, there are those who break off and decide on violent methods, or those who enter nonviolent assemblies seeking to divert its purposes, and they must also be resisted. And I think this is more or less the point that Robin made. This is simply a repetition of state propaganda regarding outside agitators, etc., a fairly straightforward and long-standing disciplinary strategy designed to produce the position of the good protester and the bad protester, assuring that one kind of protester comports precisely with the book's agenda, which is also, in this case, the state's agenda, and we have no choice but to ask after this coincidence. Now, the book is firm in its commitment not to call this into question, and that may indeed be a question with which I will leave us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and we will come back to that. Marianne?
Yeah, I'm just going to have to...
Okay.
Hold on. Okay. I'm going to switch the tone a little bit here. Let's see.
Do you want to turn on your
Yes,
microphone?
I will.
Great, thank you.
Hopefully this will work.
Did you just now use it?
Somehow. Okay,
There it is.
here it is. Okay, can you see this? Great. So I'm an English professor too, and I'm not really a political theorist, so I do talk about objects. And the thing that was most interesting to me about the book, if you read my blog post, were issues of embodiment, vulnerability, and the change that we've really undergone from the moment Butler wrote the book to today. I'll try to time myself here. So it's really a remarkable coincidence that we're speaking about Assembly just 3 days after my return from Istanbul, where I spent part of my spring break. This was my first visit there, and my third visit there, and my first was in September 2013, just 2 months after the Gezi Park protests were ended. And I was there with a transnational feminist working group sponsored by Columbia's Center for the Study of Social Difference and convened by Judith Butler and Zeynep Gambetti at Columbia's Global Center there. And the topic of our 4-day workshop was rethinking vulnerability and resistance. So although the Gezi protests had been brutally stopped and the park had been closed to any form of assembly, and although ominous water gun trucks were lining the squares adjoining Istiklal Street, the mood was in our group was electric. Our Turkish colleagues, who were supposed, like the rest of us, to prepare presentations, spent their time instead to describe the heady and hopeful weeks they had spent gathering in the park in late spring and early summer. They were eagerly anticipating rekindling the movement in the same vein once the students were back from summer vacation. Things didn't exactly happen that way. They described their tactics and demands, the remarkable courage they and others had shown in the face of standoffs with an ever more brutal police response. We discussed the bodily effect of gathering together and the moments that had gone viral as memes, such as the woman in the red dress, which I'm sure you've seen, or the standing man who also had gone viral. I think that what these memes show us is how vulnerability can be mobilized deliberately and strategically as tools of resistance, how they are in fact agentic, how they, how the virtual and the embodied actually work together to produce these tactics. They also show how once bodies are gathered, they could not be isolated from each other, that we see the standing man separate from the other people, but in fact they are together. So the assemblies had been dispersed, but their effects lived on in the bodies of everyone who had been there, and they were transmitted to the rest of us who were in this small seminar in the Columbia Global Center. On Saturday morning of that week, many of us walked along Istiklal Street to Galatasaray Square to join the Saturday Mothers for their weekly vigil. This group has been gathering since 1995 to remember family members who had been forcibly disappeared and murdered by the government during the late 1980s and 1990s, and also more recently, and also to protest state-sponsored violence more generally. This is truly a nonviolent form of assembly. Some came to recall even more distant victims of the Armenian genocide, for example. So unlike the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who had actually inspired this tactic, these Saturday mothers / people, as they call themselves, sit instead of walking, but in fact, their identity as mourning mothers, very much inspired by the madres, is meant to ensure their freedom to gather, though in fact, like the madres, they're very conscious and shrewd political actors as well, because here they position themselves exactly in ways that make sure that they are photographed and that their photographs are displayed, not just virally, but also on the internet, that they become viral. They were facing out. So I think that Butler's book and my blog post were inspired by these discussions in Turkey and the vulnerabilities that we witnessed, faced and practiced there. So while the project in which we participated was at the time called Rethinking Vulnerability and Resistance, the book the edited volume that was edited by Butler and Gambetti and Leticia Sapsoy is entitled Vulnerability in Resistance. So these two, the copula had to change because these two terms and these two concepts had to be inextricably connected once we began to write our pieces. And I alluded to this in my post. So let me just go now to my current visit, which was quite different. Many of the Turkish colleagues who had been part of our initial group and the subsequent working group that I had convened at the Global Center on Women Mobilizing Memory a year later are now on their second and third hearings as academics for peace. They were among the 1,200 signatories of an open letter to President Erdogan urging him to initiate a peace process with Kurdish rebels in southern Turkey. So this was not an embodied assembly. This is the signing of an open letter, an act of protest that I think most of us at some point or other engage in, but they are now being tried. And some of the signatories were fired from their jobs, others had their passports removed, others still have already been convicted to either 15 or 25 months in prison, and that's a very significant difference because you can defer a prison sentence that's under 24 months, but over 25 months, you can contest it, but appeal it, but you cannot defer it. So they're all awaiting court dates to continue working, and even as they await their next court dates, they continue working, discussing, attempting to be out on the street, such as during the recent March 8th nighttime march for International Women's Day that was very violently put down with rubber bullets and pepper spray. And in fact, this is what Galatasaray Square, where the Saturday Mothers used to sit, looks like today. This was Saturday morning. The mothers had been brutally dispersed, and some of them had been detained last summer. Their maternal identities did not in any way protect them. And public spaces around Istanbul are closed off to any form of assembly at all. So I think there's still a strong we among the academics for peace, among students, among many others through Turkey. Though facing stronger and more violent response, they no longer assemble in the same ways. The arbitrary acts of repression, arbitrary sentences sow fear, anger, confusion, and discouragement. And yet again and again, they insist that they need to go on because they are not alone. They feel that they are still assembled, and they assemble on WhatsApp, they assemble on Facebook, and in conferences and talks such as the one that I was there to attend. And they're still fueled by the power of the embodied assemblies of the last years, even though these virtual gatherings enable them to continue to defy autocratic repression, even though they cannot assemble on the streets in the same way. And actually, I would say that these virtual gatherings may not make them less vulnerable, actually, because there's a whole science of how you use your phones and what kind of evidence is allowed to be on your phones and whether Facebook is being watched and so on. So let me now actually go to the topic I wanted to discuss with you, because just like I couldn't resist bringing these bodies into the room, but I actually wanted to talk about this, which is whether the space of the aesthetic can provide a form. What I wanted to bring in is adding to our discussions of theory and praxis another term, which is poesis, which is making and which is the aesthetic, and wondering whether the aesthetic as a space of encounter, of responsiveness, of intersubjectivity, of shared vulnerability may not be one way to create a we. Not so much a we the people, but a we that can be a space of the political, that can be used and mobilized in political ways, or that is already political in being created this way. So I just wanted to show you this work, and let me see if I can. Okay, so this is a performance, a political performance by Maria Jose Contreras. I gave you the link in the blog post so other people can look at it later if you haven't read it. This was staged on the 40th anniversary of the coup in Chile on September 11th. And it was staged from 8:49 to 9 for 11 minutes. And she, on the internet, connected, asked for, on Facebook and other social media, asked for 1,200 volunteers to come and lie between the two major squares in Santiago to show what it means to have disappeared and murdered, because these are the detenidos, desaparecidos, the ones who were killed, murdered, disappeared and killed, to show what it, what kind of space these bodies who are now absent, how one can make them present again. You see how vulnerability is mobilized here by these people and these bodies. And it's an 11-minute performance. She did not ask for permission, for a permit from the city. They appeared and then disappeared, but they live on the internet, so that's really important, and they can be virtually experienced. And I think that they can produce even virtually, I think, a visceral response to the vulnerable body on the street and its connection with other bodies. So I think that this kind of participatory performance shows the aesthetic as a space of politics. And I'd love to talk more about the connections that we might make between praxis and poesis, not just with this kind of participatory performance piece, which has its political whose political implications are obvious, but maybe through other aesthetic forms that mobilize vulnerability and thus create a space of intersubjective encounter. Thanks.
Thank you, Marianne, and thanks for raising that third term, which is kind of pregnantly absent from the critique of praxis, theoria, praxis, and of course poesis. So we'll come back to that because I want to explore it with you, Nandini.
Well, thanks, Vernon, for organizing this and inviting me. And I'm sorry, my voice has been out of action for a couple of weeks, so if you can't hear me, I'm sorry about that. I'm going to start with another poem from the one that I wrote about in my blog essay, and this is Brecht's well-known The Solution, where, and I'm quoting, "After the uprising of the 17th June, the secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed in the Stalin Alley, stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. Would it not be easier in that case for the government to dissolve the people and elect another?" So I think part of the absurdity and the charge of this poem is the fact that the people can't be elected, that assemblies are unpredictable. And that's what Butler emphasizes, makes them so interesting. It's their transience which makes them critical. It's not the governments that they institute, it's not the politics that they institute, but the fact that they come into being through people who are unknown to each other, coming together for common objects and then disappearing again and then coming back through new objects and new modes of organizing. But I think one thing that Butler, this is something that I hadn't reflected upon in my essay, but I've been thinking about since, has not adequately perhaps dealt with, while she talks about this importance of infrastructure, the space of the pavement in enabling assembly, the space of law, the space of non-human objects, technology, the media in particular, in enabling the space of assembly. What she doesn't reflect upon so much is the temporality and the spatiality of assembly. And in particular, the fact that assemblies of the kind of the Hariri, for instance, last for such long periods that people come and go and dwell in these places makes them very different from the kinds of assemblies that are flash mobs, that or assemblies of different kinds of people marching on different days, because the kind of assembly that aims to topple a government which refuses to be toppled, as in Algeria today, is a very different kind of long-term inhabitation of an assembly from the kind of other forms of assemblies that we think about. And the kind of people that are created through this long-term cohabitation in the square or in that space of assembly is very different from the kind of people who inhabit other kinds of temporary assemblies. I was also thinking about the kinds of assemblies that you have in the area that I've been working on, armed guerrilla movements in the forest, where people come together in assemblies which work precisely because they are secret, because they are known to nobody apart from the people who are assembling, which is very different from the kinds of assemblies which require the media to propagate themselves, to recognize themselves as large assemblies. So what does it mean to assemble outside the media? What does it mean to assemble when nobody else except you know that you're there for that political objective? And we've got so used to thinking about the media as the enabling form in which assembly happens, that to recognize that there is some value to just being out there, to having your body next to somebody else's body, and the joy of being together is something that it's important to remember. We also, I mean, the kinds of spaces, and I think Joshua touched upon this, in the sense of the space of the square being both a commercial space and space of public assembly, but I think we also have to keep reminding ourselves that these squares or these large public spaces were really built by the state to speak to people. And all of these assemblies are, in a sense, handed out by the state at will and taken back by the state at will, because we're constantly negotiating with the state as to where we can assemble and how we can assemble and for how long we can assemble. And that really brings in the role of the police, and Butler talks about the limiting, well, not the limiting role of the police, but the prison as the limit of the assembly. So the idea that apart from those who are actually assembled, there are people who cannot assemble because they are in prison, or they are somehow, they are at work and they don't have the space and the ability to take time off to protest or to assemble. But it's, whenever we think about the police or the prison as the outer limit of assembly, we're also giving power to somebody else, both in terms of giving us the space as well as giving us the freedom to actually assemble, and to then limit our own power of assembly by something that is imposed, by something that is arbitrary, is something that we cannot do without, but something that is worrying to us. But I think for me, the most interesting parts of the book were not the sections on assembly per se, but they were the sections on vulnerability and the importance of cohabitation. And I kept asking myself how it is that we can cohabit a space, an ethical space, with people who look like us, should be like us, but are actually not like us, because the kinds of bodies that respond to other people's pains are bodies, or other people's anxieties, other people's vulnerabilities, are bodies that have been disciplined and produced in certain ways. And after, just thinking about Assad or Foucault, we cannot think about bodies outside the kind of genealogy of disciplining that they've been subjected to. So the kind of reaction that one might have to somebody else's vulnerability is not simply an embodied reaction, but it's a learned reaction, historically produced reaction. And that's what's worrying, that when we talk about vulnerability not as injurability, but as openness, as that sense of being able to respond when called upon. The fact that we are called upon in so many different ways and respond sometimes with cruelty when we are being asked for compassion is something that really worries me in terms of how we can cohabit in a responsible way. And there are two ways in which I was thinking about the current times and how, like Marianne, how they're different from the time that Butler wrote these essays. And the fact that right-wing assemblies are now the sort of dominant motif of our times. And not only are we faced with the counter-assembly, the assembly that aims to tyrannize, but also the very fact that our assemblies are used by the government to further our precarity, to further our sense of helplessness because we can be so easily disassembled by violence. And the question of violence is not something that we define, or non-violence is not something that we define on our own, but it's defined by how the government defines whether we are a violent movement or not, because one can so easily be labeled non-violent simply by being arrested or charged or beaten, and then you naturally react in self-defense. So I don't think that questions of assembly can really be separated from the counter-assembly, and I'm not sure that we can really think about our vulnerability without thinking about how in this age of the Anthropocene we are not only just responsible to the non-human, to future generations, but also to the very people that we hate, who hate us, and who neither we can wish away and nor can they wish away, nor can they wish us away from the world. And what will it take to continue assembling in the face of their existence and our existence, and what would it require for us to assemble in this horrible world today? Stop there.
Thank you. Okay, well, these have been very rich presentations, and the interconnections are many. And I have some thoughts, but before I jump in, Thomas, do you want to go first?
If you don't want.
I do, but I'd like, I'm trying to be generous.
Okay, well, I'll do my best. So, thank you all very much for these wonderful, thought-provoking blog posts. As a historian, I was thinking a lot about questions of historicity and time, but also space, which came up a lot, obviously, in your presentations. And what struck me very much was really this idea that the very historicity of the moment that Judith Butler was talking about, and the moment that we're in today, and what has changed, and the kind of exuberance, excitement of this moment here has waned to a certain extent, been revealed to be a form of naivete perhaps, and left space to the counter-assemblies of the right. And in just thinking about that now, another moment of a missed historical opportunity came to mind that hasn't come up in any of the discussion so far, which is that of the 1930s, of course, and Adorno's attempt to theorize how the libidinal investment that led the working class to end up voting for Hitler. And so I was thinking in terms of what proto-Marxists were trying to theorize at that time, particularly because of the emphasis on the bodies, and the bodies, and Nandini, you were talking about the joy of being together, and I'm thinking about what else is there that comes out when we are together with other people, and the sort of the psychic investments, the affective investments. Butler does talk much more about the question of transience that I found very interesting, and you both talked about this in the Poesis and the sort of the flash mob performance forms of assembly. This maps on nicely, I think, with the rhizomatic structure of these forms of assembly, that they appear and they emerge around the world, and they're all sort of connected underground, but they all have their own forms of expression. And so I'm just going to try to sort of enumerate a few of the spatial metaphors that I picked up here. Robin, you invited us to think about look at the margins of the demos, to look at those sort of transient liminal figures, the indigenous populations, the refugees, the people who are not crossing borders but have borders crossing them. I found that very, very talkative. Nandini, you on the other hand ask us to focus right at the core of the demos, the bigot who lives next door, the person that we have to live with because we share this same world with the same street, the same square. Joshua, you were in between, navigating between the public and the private, the forms of aggregation, the composition problem that this situation leads to, and Marianne, of course, you were thinking about the aesthetic encounters that this coming together of different groups can produce. All of these forms of space and place imply forms of futurity, have visions of futurity in them. Different horizons of expectation, whether it's the aesthetic heterotopias that you were talking about, Marianne, the forms of resistance, violent, non-violent, the non-hegemonic claims. What would a non-hegemonic claim that would not run the risk of turning into exclusionary, into an essentializing form be? And of course, Joshua, you were very provocative, thought that maybe democracy itself needs to be called into question, that cannot be telos insofar as it is always already subsumed by capital, is coextensive with capitalist modernity itself. And incidentally, I agree with you very much that Tocqueville saw this very clearly already in the 19th century. So to wrap this up, in thinking the time and space of these blog posts, on the one hand, I kept thinking, well, are we not still trapped in the dilemmas of the general will, and Rousseau's desperate attempt to find a form of collectivity that would also be the condition for the expression of individual difference, which of course he thought could only really happen in an ancient city-state, or perhaps at most in a small little island in the middle of the Mediterranean. I think Butler gestures towards this problem when she talks about, and Nandini, you brought this up again right at the end, the problem of how do we find an ethical response at a distance, right close by with people we don't want to, but also at a distance with people we want to, but we don't necessarily know. And I would add, for a tomorrow, for a different future. I found myself thinking about these questions a couple of weeks ago in debating with my 13-year-old daughter whether she should go on strike for the climate strike on March 15th. And so this brings up the question of climate change. I think it's a perfect example of this idea of how do we find forms of empathy with people that are at a distance. And the best I could find at the time, and I'm very embarrassed to sort of admit to this, was to bring up Edmund Burke and his notion of an intergenerational social contract that would provide grounds for not sort of sacrificing the future in the name of the present. Of course, I'm thinking of this also in terms of Brexit right now, but that's another issue altogether. So I really do not want to leave us on Edmund Burke. I would hate to, so I'm hoping you have some better thoughts of how do we think about climate change also in terms of forms of assembly.
Thanks, Thomas. All right, I'll jump, and then maybe we'll take two more interventions before we turn back to the panelists. So just to pick up on one of your points, Thomas, the notion of naivete, right? So it's I think I might not present it as a question of naivete so much as a question that, you know, praxis is historically situated, inevitably. And all forms of praxis are going to be historically situated, and therefore not only situated, but then also counterable, or can be turned around and redeployed, and that there's going to be, you know, ideological drift and transformations and reappropriations and co-optations of all forms of praxis. So when I often think about this, I mean, I do, as I was rereading the text and discussing it in class and whatnot, it's clear that the we the people language is very jarring today in a way that it wasn't in 2015. And of course it's jarring today because of all of the populism. I mean, and look, I mean, populism was always an issue. It's not as if it's only this year that we're thinking about it in a problematic way. But nevertheless, I think that there's a difference in balance all of a sudden. But I mean, what that might suggest is that, you know, the assembly at the time was also perhaps far more appropriate for its historical context. Like, you think about Occupy Wall Street as having had a particular place at a particular time, as a particular effort actually to push President Obama in a certain direction, right? And of course, it wouldn't have at all the same balance today, or effectivity today. It would be completely ignored or mocked or whatever. But at the time, in the situation, with a president who was a Democrat, it was pushing in a way and was functional historically that it might not be today. Same, of course, for the other assemblies. So 3 points I wanted to continue the conversation and then send back to you. The first, of course, having to do with this question of nonviolence that both Joshua and Robin and raised. It does seem that, you know, the normative claim or the ethical claim to nonviolence is probably not the right way to go in this context, because the real questions are what work constructions of violence and constructions of nonviolence do, right? So actually, you would want to, you know, to borrow the performativity, it would be these questions of the performativity of the construction of nonviolence and violence. And one interesting, and of course, delegitimation, clearly, you know, that's always going to be true of a construction of violence of a movement, and in bringing up the Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement, the way it was received and characterized is the perfect example. I think here is where, you know, the yellow vests right now, the Gilets jaunes in France, is a particular interesting phenomenon to think about through the lens of the construction of violence and the place of nonviolence. The torching of Fouquet's, right, is an extraordinarily symbolic act. This isn't a question of are you in favor or are you against torching Fouquet's, but the target, right, and the visualization of this attack on the penultimate place of luxurious, you know, Champs-Élysées tourism, right, is remarkable. And I think it has had a remarkable effect on the imagination and on the way in which people are thinking more broadly, not just in a negative way about the Gilets jaunes, but about what the messages, the targeting, for instance, of the Champs-Élysées, or the fact that all of the banks in Paris now are boarded up, basically, have become fortresses. It's remarkable. Even in neighborhoods that are not, even in neighborhoods outside of the Champs-Élysées, where most of the violence has been, you can be in the Quartier Latin, and it's all plywood, the banks. You know, they have become the fortresses. And that in itself does an amazing amount of work, of symbolic work, of what the movement is about, and it's all due to the fact that the windows were getting broken. And you can kind of sense the disparities in which windows are broken and which windows aren't broken. The luxury shops next to, you know, the sandwich shop, which has not been attacked or whatnot, right? All of this is extremely poignant in a way that I think we need to think about. Not so much in, you know, are you for it or are you against it, but in what it is actually achieving and what work it's doing. So that would be one thing that I think we need to spend more time on. But I think the case of the Gilets jaunes is particularly interesting. The second one, the aesthetic dimension. So we haven't been, well, it's just, I mean, well, it's not that we haven't been exploring that, but this is kind of theory and praxis, and that has been not explicitly on the table. So here's one thing. I went to the Maria Jose Contreras site to look at the performance and whatnot, and to read her description of it. And there was one sentence that just struck me, and it was when she said something like, even if I was the author, and I think she put quotes around it originally, and then there's also a footnote where she talks about the fact that although she came up with the idea, there were many others who contributed and whatnot. And I was thinking about the notion of authorship in this particular context, and the notion, the relationship between authorship and leaderlessness in the more political, in the more praxis, on the more praxis side. I found it jarring, this notion of authoring this manifestation. To a certain extent, all of a sudden, all of a sudden it diminished it to me. That in fact, there are actors playing the parts, in a sense. And I've participated in this. I've actually, in aesthetic productions, I remember, being a paid, and I'm not sure anyone was paid, I'm sure there were a lot of people, volunteers, etc. But nevertheless, I've done aesthetic performances where I've been compensated for, being part of someone who's carrying a, big thing, whatever.
Unpack.
Nah. But it's different, right? If you conceive of yourself, I mean, if there's this dimension of acting, authorship, etc., it's something that, to me, all of a sudden diminished the force of the production itself. It's like, if it had been the case, if I had been told, for instance, that this was just in Santiago, in Chile, everybody, like, we did it on Facebook somehow, and we all just dropped as a political act, that seems different than I'm going to do this as a performance, and I'm going to get people to do it with me or something. I don't know. So that's something I want to.
Clear that up for
You
a
could,
minute?
yeah, sure.
I mean,
Yeah,
just
please
to
do.
clarify, she called for volunteers on Facebook. I mean, she produced it because she had the drones to photograph, the photographers. I mean, everything was prepared. But she called for the 1,200 volunteers on Facebook, and 1,200 people showed up, and somehow they managed in that short time to actually go those several kilometers between the two squares. So it's something quite between those. So they're not
Right.
actors who had rehearsed it, and it was produced in that way. But it was produced, and I think it's significant that she says that, but we can talk about that later. I don't
Yeah,
want to interrupt you.
no, that's, so production, right, which is part of creation. So that's something I would want to explore. And then on the question of vulnerabilities, Nandini, the way in which you were raising this question I thought was really provocative, and of course it relates to Marianne's intervention also on vulnerabilities, which is that it's not a natural instinct, right? It's a socially, I mean, the reaction to vulnerability is not a natural instinct. It's not that we can just count on empathy. It's not that there's going to be this immediate response. It's a socially learned process, as you were saying. And I think that's a really helpful way to think about it and to problematize it, because then we really need to think about how we affect that process that produces the responses to vulnerability. And I'm not sure that, I'm not sure how we do that. That would be something I would like to know and learn and discuss. I'm not sure whether it is, how it is possible. And then, I mean, and this relates to Joshua Clover's work. which is whether these processes can be, and we were talking about this earlier, whether these processes can be affected in a kind of self-conscious way, such as to try to produce particular forms of resistance, or whether those resistance are being generated and produced through other mechanisms, and so therefore, we just don't have kind of the control over the processes that would affect the ways in which we respond to the vulnerabilities. So those were a couple of thoughts and provocations. Maybe we'll take a couple more before we return to you. Nikita and Shauna. Nikita, you want to start?
Sure. It strikes me that the two of the most thorny questions that your comments have raised, one from Robin about how to displace the hegemonic we without replacing it, and then from Nandini about how we distinguish between what we might call emancipatory assemblies from right or counter assemblies, sort of what's substantively different between those. And it seems to me that in my experience in reading about this wave of assemblies from the late aughts through the teens of the 2000s, that an answer to that might actually come in the question that Joshua posed about interrogating democracy itself as a category, as a horizon. So to say a little bit more about that, it's interesting that we haven't really talked much about what actually happens in these assemblies, or what they're for, what their goals are. And certainly that'll be different in different movements that we're talking about, but there seems to me to be a dividing line between whether assemblies are conceived of as democratic in the sense of establishing a bounded demos and remonopolizing legitimacy, versus conceived of as spaces of encounter, spaces in which people from a variety of different positions socially can meet each other, collaborate, and form projects that establish their own legitimacy outside of that space. Because it would seem to me that within the framework of democracy, including direct democracy, radical democracy, as it's conceived of by Butler and others, that there's sort of two key features that have, I think, marked some of the limits of the assembly movements that we've seen in recent years. One of which is sort of, whether inadvertently or not, making a claim for a we that becomes hegemonic. Whether it's hegemonic, whether it's claimed as hegemonic in a broader social context, or just in a micro context of within a movement, within a physical space, that demos always has boundaries. And so, like in my personal experience in the Occupy movement, tends to be sort of around people who adhere to certain rules of procedure, or people who can attend meetings at certain times of the day, or people it's rarely defined in strictly identitarian terms in the way that, say, like a Golden Dawn assembly in a neighborhood in Greece might be defined as excluding non-Greeks, but in its functional aspects reproduces a similar process. And then the second thing is that in directly democratic discourses, the legitimacy of decisions or actions is based on the process by which those decisions are made and the time and space in which they're made, rather than, for example, if they meet the needs of the people who are making them or who are subjected to them, or whether they have positive outcomes or anything like that. So so there's this sort of remonopolization of legitimacy through this sort of fiat that Butler describes of like the coming together, the illocutionary politics of just articulating ourselves into a we through our bodies, which is interesting, but then becomes this limit when a lot of these assemblies become these sort of micro states in which governmentality is reproduced through the sort of, in many cases, quite random assemblage of whoever happens to be there. So it's worth acknowledging that this is sort of right out of the anarchist critique of democracy that's been articulated out of participants in these movements, and I'm not saying anything new. So in counterposing something against those two limitations, when I talk about the assembly as a space of encounter, I think that involves questioning democracy itself as a framework in the way that Joshua has implied, by thinking about sort of what experiments in freedom and self-determination might look like when we're not constructing a delimited demos, and when we're not centralizing or monopolizing legitimacy in a particular physical space or body or time and space in the square. And for example, like accounts from Spain in the 15M movement about how the literal, like physical margins, not just the marginal subjects, but the actual physical outskirts of some of these occupied plazas were the places where the most interesting and constructive discussions were happening, where the gender roles were subverted in different ways, where power wasn't monopolized by aspiring politicians from NGOs in the same ways. So, so just two quick examples to sort of bring this home. In Bosnia in 2014, there was an uprising and assembly movement that doesn't get as much press as some of the other more popular ones, where in February 2014 in several cities in Bosnia, the government buildings were burned down and politicians were literally chased out. And then out of that, an assembly movement rose up of these plenums in which, through a sort of stultifying, directly democratic process, the energy of the combative street movement sort of withered and died. And the article that's my main reference point for this, written by folks that I talked to there, is Born in Flames, Died in Plenums, which, you know, anyone who's ever been to a really boring assembly can sort of see echoes of resonances in this. But I think there's an interesting counterpoint in the stories I've heard, and I wasn't there, so please, if you were there, correct me, about the last day of the Gezi Park occupation, in which sort of previous efforts to have a park-wide assembly were really stymied by just the incredible diversity of people who were there, by everyone from anti-capitalist Muslims to LGBT groups to environmental groups to radical feminists to anarchists and socialists, communists, Kurdish activists, etc., having so many disagreements about tactics, about goals, etc., that a directly democratic process that centralized legitimacy in a particular body and process just wasn't able to achieve their goals. So what ended up happening is that the park was divided into 7 different sectors in which 7 different assemblies from different self-organized, however they constituted themselves, whether on the basis of identity or affinity or whatever, 7 different assemblies happened where folks, under the rubric of the shared goal of defending the park, autonomously organized their own sense of how they wanted to participate in that project according to their own values, their own logics, and their own skills. And while ultimately they were not successful in preventing the eviction of the park, there's 2 salient things about the story that stuck out to me. One is that they defended and held the space much longer than anyone expected them to, because I think in part of the sort of versatility and dispersion of their efforts, and also the fact that they weren't trying to shoehorn into a consensus process all of this wild variegated diversity meant that these links of affinity between quite different social actors were forged that then could continue to exist as a sort of mycelial or rhizomatic network that lasts into the future and can be a foundation for subsequent resistance efforts. So anyway, that's just a long-winded way of saying that maybe the anarchist critique of democracy that Joshua gestured towards might offer some ways out of these problems.
Great, thanks. Shana? And then we'll come back. Maybe we'll come back with Nandini this way. Go ahead.
Thank you for those blog posts and presentations. Robin, I had a question for you. Your comment on delinking the idea of assemblies from that of people actually reminded me of a call that went out during the assembly that took place outside of JFK when the first ban on nationals traveling from predominantly Muslim countries took place. And the call went out after word came in that the police was sending reinforcements. And the wording was something like this. those of you who are here on a visa or are undocumented, please step back. The police are coming, and we will fight this fight for you. And once that call occurred, the sort of the border that had been crossed among the we in that assembly sort of came back again, and you could literally see a sort of spatial movement of people. Clearly, I was one of them, moving back. The inner circle of that assembly beginning to face the police, and the sort of outer circle in the parking lot. And it made me think about how, prior to thinking about how the assembly has to interact with the state, the assembly has to constantly think about how its constituent bodies begin to establish relationships with each other. All the other questions of democracy, etc., following that relationship that we can set up with each other. Nandini, to you, I think I have much more a question coming out of assemblies in India, and at least my experience of being part of assemblies in India. I think that whether it is being part of an assembly in Kashmir which can be shot at and where people are throwing stones back at the army, or whether it's in an assembly in Delhi where you have a fairly elite group of students protesting against the government trying to establish all kinds of bans on the university. The assembly is constantly depicting the expansive limits of the public in India, and because of this is demonstrating its vulnerability as well. But what your piece made me think about, especially the part about the police, is about how, at least when we assembled, what we were afraid of was not so much the police but the counter assembly. Going with the policemen, drinking chai with them within the precincts of the prison, and we would be let out in the evening. But the counter assembly is constantly present and constantly there to undermine the assembly gathering in the first place at all. What struck me is that the assembly kept gathering, knowing that the public space is and will constantly be marked by that kind of violence from the counter assembly, and therefore reclaiming the truth of our bodies didn't lie in being arrested. It lay in actually constantly showing up and constantly turning up against that counter assembly. I don't know what to do with that, but just in terms of some of the points that you raised as well, in terms of thinking about non-violence, and I mean, there's no way in which turning up and showing up can be a non-violent act. It's constantly marked by violence.
Thank you, Shana. So, Nandini, do you want to start addressing some points that?
Yeah, well, I thought those were very interesting comments.
Do you want to turn on your mic?
Yeah, sorry. Just to respond to what Nikita said about the governmentality that attends people trying to build coalitional politics in assemblies, and how that itself is such a draining act of state making and power, and how one could, in a leaderless assembly, actually escape that kind of attempt to hegemonize what Robin was talking about, the kind of need to not have a hegemonic assembly but to counter-hegemonize the forms of politics. I'm not sure that we've really learned, we haven't sort of talked enough about how one actually conducts coalitional politics in that kind of large space, and how one prevents assemblies from being then put to other uses which you did not intend them to be put to. So that's something that I think we need to discuss. Again, this question that you raised about vigilantism as this constant backdrop against which people assemble, I think that also connects to the question of strikes and how you cannot have a strike without scabs, you cannot have a strike. I mean, so all of these forms of protest are essentially within the frame of what somebody else might call violent, but you are trying to be nonviolent with. So I don't think that there is, to talk about the moral imperative to have nonviolent movements is good, but in practice, it's not something that one can decide in advance.
So I have lots of thoughts and questions. All of these comments are so provocative. I want to come back to the idea of vulnerability, and of course, vulnerability is learned, and the way we regard our bodies is totally learned, and we've learned all that from Butler herself. And it's very interesting that here the body comes in such a material way, and very differently from her earlier work. But I think she makes a really crucial distinction that I think we have to keep in mind, which is what does it mean on the one hand to acknowledge vulnerability and on the other hand to deny it. And I think when we see in the slide I showed where you have the police in riot gear and with clubs and behind glass, and then you have these other bodies, I think that the denial of vulnerability is a very, very different way to engage cohabitation and living together. And I'm wondering if there is an opening there and a kind of acknowledgement of vulnerability, however learned it is, but we're still living in bodies and in time that are that are essentially vulnerable. But that vulnerability is also differently imposed by social and economic and political conditions. If that, if there's a way to sort of get people to acknowledge their own vulnerabilities and the differential vulnerability, I think we would have a very different form of cohabitation. The hatred and disgust and abjection that you evoked for us is also embodied, and it's also transmitted, intergenerationally transmitted. It might even be epigenetically transmitted at this point, racism and hatred for the other. So the question is how we can take that embodiment into account when we discuss cohabitation. So that's sort of one thing that I wanted to add here. The other one is, what's the horizon of assembly? And the question about whether democracy is our only possible horizon is really important to me, because I think I'd like to connect to the discussion we had last week, which is like, let's burn it all down and start over. And isn't
Did I miss that?
Yeah, we missed it. We're so much more rational this time. I don't think Butler necessarily leads us there, because I think she's talking about the unpredictability of assembling people and acting without knowing what the consequences of our action are going to be. And I think things happen in the square that we absolutely cannot predict. We go in demanding one thing because you have to have a slogan, you have to have a demand. And Occupy was really fantastic in actually just being so counterintuitive in absolutely every step in which it went about some of those things, the leaderlessness, the non-demand, all of that. But I think if we take that unpredictability, which is to me very much connected both to vulnerability and to performance, because I think nonviolence is a performative enunciation. Of course, we all know that it leads to violence, but you could still claim nonviolence, and I think it does something to at least have that as a way. And I think the whole thing is just a wager, and it's profoundly, assemblies are profoundly irrational. When the mothers keep walking in Argentina, right now I saw their anniversary march in which they were in wheelchairs and being walked. And they've been doing this, to the point where they're now no longer able to walk themselves. What are they asking for? And what does it say on their kerchiefs? Aparición con vida. We want them back alive. They've been saying that since the 1970s. It's profoundly irrational. So I think we have to take that irrationality into account rather than trying to normalize these demands as though people are asking for what can actually happen. They're not doing that. There's something in the performance of the demand that I think we have, and so that brings me to the aesthetic and to the question that Bernard asked, which is, why does authorship diminish the effect of the work? Authorship in question. Now, no, we've had the death of the author, and this is a participatory performance that is staged, but when people participate in it, and they're not paid actors, I mean, even if they were paid actors, I wonder if lying on the ground, on the street in that way, when they're not expected to be there, people don't know they're going to appear in this particular way, might not have a particular effect on the people witnessing it, on themselves, on their own bodies. Many people came because they were relatives of the murdered, disappeared. Women came who were pregnant. I mean, this was an extremely participation in embodied vulnerability. And what effect does it have to have this scar go through the city? Now, of course, it happens on the ground, but it also has to be photographed through drones so that you can see the scar that's being made. So I think there is something there that extends to other forms of aesthetic productions where the response, no matter how much an author tries to plan it, is going to be utterly unpredictable. And often not at all what's being, you quoted Brecht, and Brecht could never make anything happen that he really wanted to make happen. And that was his success. That was why he's so brilliant, because people did not respond in the way he wanted them to respond, which is rationally. They responded emotionally. And he didn't know how to figure that into his plan, but that's why, they went out and sang the songs, which is, he wanted them to leave all that response behind. So I don't know why we have to fetishize spontaneity in these. All these assemblies are staged. I mean, somebody has to plan it. Yes, maybe. And now with Facebook and social media, we can actually plan it in a few minutes, which is pretty amazing. But what's going to happen there is not going to be predictable.
Thanks, Marianne. Joshua.
There's way too much to talk about, and a lot of important points that have already been made. I'm almost going to try and pull off a bunch of responses under a single coherent bracket. It's not going to quite work. But it's sort of like the question, the meta question, or the slapback question I had is sort of, what are we counting as durée? What are we counting as period? How we were thinking about it. I heard several people sort of talk about the what feels like a great lived distance between 2011 and now, or even 2015 and now. And I appreciate that experience too. 2011, I was part of Occupy Oakland, which was amazing. I don't know how else to put it, but in a variegated and difficult way. And I feel the distance from that. At the same time, not a historian, but I want to be very slow to give in to such micro-durées and micro-histories, and to try and think about slightly longer cycles, periods, structures. So, for example, the airport blockades, which I'm really glad that you raised as a site to think about. And in a way, they feel like they have no durée at all, which is to say, like, Trump is inaugurated on January 20th, so-called Muslim ban, airport blockade on the 28th, right? Like, that's no time at all. And I still want to insist that they are thinkable also, and perhaps more substantially, as part of a long-term phenomenon about the end of absorptive labor markets, the closing of borders that comes with it when capital loses its interest in labor flows almost entirely, and mobilizes xenophobia around a systematic closure of borders across Europe right now, obviously, and Trump's fascination with the wall has to be understood as xenophobia, but also has to be understood as labor market management, right? And that phenomenon where, for a long time, the capital class in the United States was very committed to open borders, right? Because they wanted labor flow. And that's decreasingly true. America has one premise, right? It's written on the Statue of Liberty. We'll take your labor inputs, right? That's what that poem says. And it's over, right? And that's a phenomenon that's unfolded over the course of 150 years. And particularly over the course of, since the crisis of the 70s, from which capital's not recovered. And when we think about the current super xenophobic, possibly fash, politics around immigration, we want to locate it in relation to transformations of capital at global scale and climate crisis, which has been sending refugees in the millions and soon the billions in motion. So I want to be careful about how we periodize and how we think about temporal movements and how things develop, and I want to be patient and look at that distance. Again, like here's a super long durée. We're still fascinated with the public-private distinction and trying to work it out. You know, that's not a transcendental distinction. It arises with private property. It's not natural. It's not real. It's enforced by violence. It's enforced by violence of the preservation of private property. And we don't need to accept it as a political truth, a political terrain, a political horizon, at least without understanding what its basis is. And that's a very long-term conceptualization of history. And, you know, same thing again with the question I want to raise about democracy that raised in the blog post, which is democracy a 2,500-year-old question going back to Athens, or is it a question that goes back to the 17th, 18th century that's totally path determined by the development of political economic networks, you know, across the planetary space, and can be thought about as a phenomenon that began, right? And here's the most optimistic thing I can say to myself when I'm very, very despairing, where it's like every single thing humans have figured out, every single way we figured out how to live with each other, to dominate each other, to be dominated, to try and be egalitarian, every single way has ended. And the one we're in now is going to end too, right? It's not infinitely resilient, it's not permanent, it's temporary. And I want to hold that durée in mind as we think about these problems. The last couple of things I'll say are about, in specific, about the point that Nikita raised about sort of, as noted, the microstate or governmentality of the assembly in the Occupy movement in various places. The way that I experienced that personally was as a real opposition between the General Assembly and the kitchen, right? I haven't done that for a while. Right, and those are sort of the two factions in the encampment that I was at. One was the nightly assembly, and it was for people who could get there, although it was big. There was a lot of people there. It wasn't exclusive. There were sort of exclusive groups within it, as we all know. Those seem inevitable enough that it seems almost pointless to complain about them. But that said, the agenda, the way of proceeding, the sense of the work that was happening there was extremely distinct from the work of the kitchen, which was basically doing that reproductive labor for people who were not the vitriolically angry, downwardly mobile middle class who provisioned much of Occupy, but were people who understood it as a Hooverville, like coming out of a depression and having no other place to live, were living in the encampment. And for them, the kitchen was what the camp was, not the General Assembly. And you know, I think the thing about Judy's book is she wants to understand that work of General Assembly and that work of reproductive labor to be the same work. And I'm not sure the book gets there, but that's the desire, and I think that's absolutely the right desire. And the model I want to throw out, right, is the Standing Rock encampment, where it's very clear that the reproductive labor of preserving that camp is not opposed to the militancy of some other action, but is the militancy, right? The camp is stopping an oil company from proceeding. It's militantly, aggressively, and sometimes violently preventing that from happening, and it does that because it has an encampment that reproduces itself every day. So it's not an 11-minute phenomenon arranged in Santiago, which I don't mean to dismiss. I'm committed to, you know, I was raised as a poet and to believe in poetry, and I'm committed to that. But I think there's a real distinction in temporality between that and the camp, which has to reproduce itself and do that reproductive labor as constitutive of its militant attack, right? And this distinction between like attack and defense or whatever, like it's all rubbish. And the point is, it not only can be integrated, it is over and over again. And I'm more concerned about the operations that pull those things apart than figuring out how to integrate them, because it's already happening. And I think other people have mentioned this, look to something like indigenous struggles. You mentioned this, right? In First Nations territory, which have this very long tradition of this exact phenomenon. as a way to think about what we're going to see, not what we should see, because I don't do should. I don't come from a place of prescription, but what we're going to see in the next decades is going to look a lot like that.
Thanks. Yeah, all these comments are really fantastic, and I just want to add maybe 2 or 3 small points. So one is coming back to this question, which also Joshua just addressed about whether there's a way to break out of the hegemonic logic, and I'm not sure whether that's the right way to put it for me. I mean, I would rather again think in a way that rather than think of the hegemonic versus the non-hegemonic, and then hope to find forms of the non-hegemonic that might escape this logic, or that might have the fantasy that they could somehow avoid the risk of exclusion or building new hegemonies. I think something like, again, sort of Balibar comes to mind, something like a counter-hegemonic. I mean, that was a term that was used in the discussion as well. A counter-hegemonic politics would be needed, where you don't have the idea necessarily or the fantasy that the non-hegemonic could just be realized here and now, but rather you would try to be attentive to the risk of reproducing the hegemonic. You would try to find epistemological forms of knowledge production, etc., that are different from the ones we know maybe, and that would allow you to detect that risk maybe better than you have been able to in the past, and that then you would have to think institutionally or organizationally maybe about ways of checking that, rather than thinking that you have successfully overcome it. So how would that look? And I mean, in a way, that leads me to think that probably, although I'm also very familiar with this kind of separation and slight preference for one of these places, that the antinomy of the kitchen and the GA is, in a way, I mean, cannot be upheld, right? Because I mean, when you read, there's of course an anarchist critique of democratic processes, but there's also a democratic critique of anarchism, and the idea that you could somehow identify needs and then just deliver on them, or that you could identify positive outcomes independently from a political process of constructing them sort of together, is also difficult to grasp, right? And I mean, at least in the history of anarchism, many attempts to do so have also had quite problematic consequences. So I wonder whether there's really a way out of sort of that political conundrum. And I mean, I see that democracy might be a term that has been somehow de-radicalized or co-opted or whatever, but I don't see an alternative, at least to democratization. I'm not sure whether democracy, as a kind of rigid signifier would be the term I would use, but something like a commitment to democratization might for me at least still capture what is at stake there. But I think we have to look to other sites where non-statist imaginaries and practices of the political are experimented with, and as Joshua also reiterated, I think indigenous struggles, migrant struggles, in my case as well, would be sites of experimentation that might be interesting in this case. Where also there's you have to develop a different kind of vocabulary. I mean, I remember that we discussed some time ago when you were involved in legal work for people at Standing Rock. One of the problems was that they didn't want what they were doing to be framed as protest, right? And you said it's very difficult to defend someone in court who doesn't want to be a protester, who's in a way just doing their thing, and then the state machine interferes and says you can't do that, and then you're framed as a protester because that's the only way to make the state listen to you. But that's not really what they're doing, right? They're not really interested in the state, as it were. I mean, they can't avoid having to be interested at some point, but so in a way, the whole vocabulary that we're used to, protest, disobedience, civility, the we, etc., that they don't really map onto some of these struggles that I think are interesting in this respect. And I mean, I think that relates also to Shauna's question with regard to what we can learn from more momentary forms of interaction within movements. So your example made me think of a conference we once organized in Amsterdam, where we brought together sort of academics and migrant activists, both how should I call them, NGO migrant activists and like real migrant activists, or migrants who are activists. And it was very interesting because the academics and the NGO activists, they were like in this depressed mood, and they said, we've done this for 20 years, it's just getting worse and worse, we cannot do this anymore. And then, some of the real migrant activists stood up and said, well, actually that's not an option, and we don't allow you to do that. And that very interesting form of political interpellation, in a way, showed that you need these moments in movements in a way, or in struggles, whatever you want to call them. So you need, in a way, to preserve this internal, I don't know how to call it, I mean, heterogeneity or whatever, to in a way keep the movement or the struggle from decaying into a kind of, I almost have a kind of Sartrean image of, when he says that you have, I mean, in a way the spectrum is, maybe the street fighting or the kind of resistance work, and then on the other hand you have the building of the Communist Party, and it just has the kind of the name tag on the door, but no one's really in there and does any work. So how do you prevent the one from morphing into the other? And I think movements need to generate this internal difference in a way and preserve it in order to keep themselves from stagnating or decaying in that way. Maybe the second point, just very quickly on the whole question of nonviolence. So I think what I agree with in Butler's analysis, and what I think is really important, is that for a lot of the movements that we're talking about, it's sort of constitutive that there's an idea of self-limitation or self-restraint. I'm not sure whether nonviolence in the strict sense is the best way to capture that. It just means that you can't sort of embrace violence in a kind of unproblematic or naive way, not necessarily because it violates certain ethical or moral prescriptions, but simply because there's a whole, I mean, the dynamic of violence is so, in a way, complicated that you can have kind of, Arendt, in a way, she didn't have a kind of moralistic argument against violence. I think she sort of tried to have a kind of action theoretical argument in a way where it's a kind of instrumentalist misperception to think that you could just use violence, like you might, I might use this book to sort of bang it on the table to make a point, maybe. I mean, I don't do that usually, but you might want to do that. And maybe it doesn't really affect my subjectivity and the point I want to bring across. Maybe it would actually. But the point about violence that both Arendt and Butler and Baliban and many others, I think, make is that violence doesn't work like that. It sort of bleeds into, like, quite literally, the subject that thinks they use it. It bleeds into the kind of aims that are pursued, and it sort of restructures the whole scene within which political action takes place. And I think it's an awareness of this that leads movements, and again, it's important that this comes from within and not sort of from a state discourse, to be careful with violence and maybe to commit to non-violence in a kind of radical spirit. And the two examples that come to mind here are, on the one hand, the ANC's decision in South Africa to move from a campaign of civil disobedience to one of armed resistance. And the fact that this campaign of armed resistance was extremely, it was subjected to strong principles of self-limitation. Of course, they didn't always function in the way in which they were supposed to, but it's important to see that. And you couldn't understand really what they were doing without taking into account the prehistory of a commitment to civility and nonviolence. So even the option for violent resistance was very much informed by the previous struggle and its commitment to nonviolence. And I think this shows precisely that to say, either violence or nonviolence just misses this kind of complex dynamic. And the other example, if I could, I would actually show you a video, but that will not be possible, is actually from Gezi Park. There's one great video which you can find online in which a whole series of protesters stands behind a broken billboard, a billboard that was shattered. And of course, the perennial question, is there something like violence against things or against property? If you destroy property, is that an act of violence? In the States, of course, and they were framed as violent terrorists and worse. So you have these protesters lining up behind the broken billboard, and they sort of make a play on a very well-known Turkish poem, which everyone knows. That's why it sort of worked. The poem goes something like, I wish I would love you just because of this, and then goes through different reasons why you might love a person. And the poet's sort of claim is that, well, I wish it was just because of this, but that's really not, why I love you. And the protesters say, I wish I would have broken you just because of this, and then they give a kind of usually sarcastic or ironic reason for why they had to break that billboard. But of course, it wasn't them, because it was only one billboard, so all of them couldn't have possibly broken it. So they sort of made an ironic well, ironic is maybe too weak, but kind of quite interesting, politically powerful point, I think, about how violence as a discourse works, and how, you know, in the middle of such a movement, it's extremely difficult to break that frame that the state imposes on you. So this was maybe a kind of street art protest / performance. I'm not so sure on which side it would come down, but I thought it was quite interesting way to again sort of problematize that seemingly dichotomistic choice between it's either violence or non-violence.
Great, thanks. Just a few footnotes before I pass on to Camilla and Jack, and then a few more. Just a few footnotes on the. I think that you really capture something with the notion of restraint rather than nonviolence. I think that's really important, particularly the ANC example that you gave, where in fact the restraint was such that it actually led to mutinies in the camps in Tanzania and Zimbabwe of ANC of young recruits to the ANC who just were frustrated that they weren't able to engage in violence, and mutinies, and then actually imprisonment and imprisonment of those ANC recruits who had mutineered, right? So I mean, it's a remarkable act of self-restraint in a sense, or a complex relationship to violence that we would need to think about, not as simple as, you know, violence or non-violence. The second point, it must be the case that the word democracy, or the concept democracy that we have on the table, is just not the right word that we're using. I mean, it's just not the right. Something else is standing in here, and I'm not sure what exactly it is, but it doesn't seem to be democracy in the traditional democratic theory way. I would think that it's almost something possibly about communalism, and relations different forms of relations between us than something about democracy. And so I would think that the term is wrong, and I think it's not a question of rethinking democratic theory or playing with democratic theory. It's finding a different vocabulary to speak about the ambition that's part of this, and the horizon that's part of this. And then the only third thing I'd say is that we're fortunate that to have your lead counsel, Noah Drellick-Smith, for the Standing Rock litigation that we're running through the center here, as well as other people on the team, Fonda Shen, who's our paralegal, and Gideon Pages, who's running the team, the general perhaps. Sorry. But anyway, so we're glad you're here. It's an effort that is being run through the center, but Noah is in charge, and it's a lawsuit in representing folks who were there regarding the restrictions on speech, on assembly, on religious expression, etc., as a result of a 5-month road closure in North Dakota. So thanks, Noah, and thanks, team. And Camilla, let me give you the speech.
Thank you. This is very, very interesting. And I wanted to, as a theorist, I wanted to go back to Arendt, because it basically, Butler uses Arendt, deploys Arendt, but in my view, it kind of like mutilates Arendt in her deployment, and therefore there's kind of these contradictions in her text that is kind of unsatisfying in some ways. One is the issue of violence that you brought up. And I would like for us to think about violence the same as Arendt thinks about freedom in spatial terms, that it has to have a space. So violence is committed in a space. And as I read Arendt, is that she envisions these spaces of freedom, and violence cannot be exerted within this space of freedom, because this space of freedom is a space of persuasion, is a space of equality. And the moment you bring violence within that space, politics is mute, she says. Violence could be exerted outside, and she's cool with that. So basically she says this is the moment of liberation. And of course, we are not there's no spaces for freedom at our end today. So therefore, the battle of the space, which is all these kind of occupying movements, are in a way a form of liberation from oppression of a non-political kind of system that we're in. And then with a division that is very unsatisfying between private and public. For Arendt, a public space is not necessarily a political space. And this is the problem with the image of the agora, because the agora is the market and also a place of private discussion, not a public discussion. So it's the ecclesia, which is artificial. It is a space that they created artificially in order to assemble and make decisions. The agora is the place where you deliberate privately with your friends and make kind of alliances, but it's not the place of politics. So therefore, there is a third space that is created and it's artificial, that does not exist. And I want to quibble a little bit with Joshua's idea that basically this is kind of a new phenomenon after Tiananmen Square. Coming from Chile myself, the people go to the public square to protest and occupy as much as they can because they want to reclaim it. And this is a very hybrid space because basically the central square, it is supposed to be public, but it's public in the sense that the state owns it and controls it. So therefore, there's the idea that the state is us, the people, but we are the people reclaiming it from the repressive forces of the state. And in a way, it is kind of like this repertoires of contention that are copied, and therefore now occupying is more like common than movement that marches, if you will. But it's just a repertoire of contention that has been around for a long while. And then in the sense that these spaces are artificial freedom, and what is the difference between a right-wing assembly and an assembly for freedom of Arendt? This is the crucial problem, because performativity doesn't cut it. Because at least from the Arendtian perspective, you need to have, it is the equality and the deliberation and the promise being performed at the moment of assembly. But fascists also are equal among themselves, and they promise among themselves, and they deliberate among themselves. So what is the difference between an assembly of the people as a non-essentialist subject and the assemblies of the ethnic or supremacist people? So then is the point of the self-limitation. What are the rules? Because this is also a very Arendtian. Freedom is inherently limited, political liberty. We cannot think about it without limits. So what are these limits? These rules of engagement of this interaction in which we are that make it this assembly, a free assembly, and not an assembly for domination, not a tool that is being copied by the dominators in order to dominate the people. So it's not only about the form and the performance, because that is also can be copied from the other side. So the principles or what is being performed and actualized in this moment. This is, and in a way, what these rules cannot be homogenizing. They have to be enablers of not the spontaneity, but what Arendt says is the new beginning. This idea that you can create something new in this world, and you are allowed to be unpredictable. Is this impossibility that makes that is made possible through the rules of enabling individuality in a way. So what are these rules? And in terms of boundaries, not only boundaries about the territory or about the space, but also the boundaries within our own individual action, within the space of freedom, and how these rules interact. So think about in these terms. I think it is productive. Thank you.
Thank you. Jack, can you grab the microphone? And what you missed, Joshua Clover, was the last session on tearing everything down and starting all over.
I heard burning.
That was the undercommons.
That was the undercommons. So, go ahead.
Okay. Just to add another layer to our discussion, I think it's kind of important to talk about the way that Butler is calling attention to the normativity of protest. Okay, so it isn't just a matter of getting the right reading of Arendt, for example, for her, and it is for them. I'm going to call Butler they, because that's how Butler understands their gender. But it's also about the gendered and sexual presumptions of these separations between private and public. And so the thing that we haven't talked about, and I'll just put on the table, is the performativity of protests. So all of the questions that we're raising about violence and democracy and anarchy and so on have embedded within them a kind of predetermined masculinism, violence in particular. And I think that's why they keep going to the nonviolent, is to try to avoid reinvesting in the violent as we've understood it, as it courses through socially understood male bodies, as opposed to other kinds of bodies. And this is where Marianne's meditation on the aesthetic is so important, because a lot of the interventions into the normativity of protest have been made by queer groups. Think ACT UP, putting a massive condom on Jesse Helms' house, for example, or Pedro Lemebel, where with the 4 horses of the apocalypse riding naked through the streets of Chile, or Roberto Jacobi from Argentina, who refuses to simply supplicate the state for help with HIV, and instead wears a T-shirt saying, "I have AIDS," and this is, he called it his strategy of joy, is to kind of double down on pleasure at the very moment when pleasure and death are being linked via HIV/AIDS. So the thing that I think is just important to put on the table is that what Butler is trying to do, in part, is pull back from the identity politics that emerges from various misreadings of both Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter. And that's why they keep saying, but it isn't your precarity is not enough. How does your precarity relate to the precarity of others? And what would be the theoretical frame in which these different forms of precarity can be thought together? So I wonder, that's why we kind of have to pull back from Arendt. We have to pull back from some of the universal narratives here, precisely because this text wants to get a little bit more particular while linking the particular to generalized expressions. So I wonder if we could get to some of these questions via queerness, just to give us some examples. I love all the Madres protests, but it bothers me too that there's, that everything has to run through the forlorn mother who's missing family members. What if we grieved instead for people we don't know, people to whom we don't have biological connection? What if we show up with random pictures to make solidarity outside of nuclearity, always then, sort of performing these roles that are already established for us before we even enter into the assembly in the first place. Second, love the Born in Flames reference that Nikita gave us. There's an amazing kind of anarchist feminist film of utopia that even has a scene of women on bicycles rounding up public rapists, just by the way, but also reminding us that actually feminism has a very deep reservoir of utopian, non-democratic, anarchist-oriented imaginaries of other forms of protest. And then finally, Gezi Park. There's a great film about Gezi Park, about the protests made by some queer Turkish activists who uncovered the way in which many of the protests, I'm not going to say they were led by trans people, but trans people played an enormous role in the Gezi Park protests. And when asked why, which was at the heart of this film, which I think was called We Resist, one of the trans activists said, because we are constantly being picked up by the police, harassed by the police, constantly surveyed by the state. So we actually do this every week. This isn't like, we didn't just show up at Gezi Park, we're doing this all the time. So let us, just put some strategies out there. And on behalf of, remember, to go to the non-human, a tree. The Gezi Park protests were about a tree. The state wanted to pull down a tree. It wasn't just about the place of assembly. It was about the non-human and the rights of the non-human to not be subject to human violence. So can we get a kind of queer understanding of assembly, of violence, of non-democratic utopia, of different kinds of political imaginaries that don't come out of the same four thinkers?
Yes.
Hi. Is it okay
Yeah.
without a microphone?
Yeah, no, I'm going to pass you my microphone, so I don't have to. Sorry.
Come forward. Yep. Yeah, the speakers.
Always carry something.
All right, thank you very much for all your interventions and presentations. I have a question about the function of Levinas here. And for me, that's a bit of a stepping into an intellectual minefield because I never truly understood Levinas, and that's problematic since I actually think he's right. And I'm not sure how to make that work. But anyway, we said before that vulnerability and the responses to vulnerability is learned. And that doesn't seem to me to be what Levinas is trying to say. I mean, saying that the vulnerability, the radical openness to the other and the other's vulnerability is something that is prior to ontology, prior to knowledge and prior to thinking, prior to politics and all that. And that there is an ethical relation that is prior to everything. But if we think that the responses to the other's vulnerabilities learned, it seems that if we truly believe that we should be taking a kind of a Hegelian route and look at the institutions that we have and say, okay, what can we affirm and what can be possible to our deepest aspirations of freedom? And that should be our job. But we seldom seem to do that. Rather, we seem to be attentive to the way that forms and norms and institutions corrupt and are corrupted. So the question is that if we don't believe that the response to vulnerability is learned, then it seems counterintuitive to believe that we should smash shit down. Because then we're also agreeing that we need these forms and institutions. But on the other hand, if we believe that institutions are corrupt and see a problem in the idea of subscribing to a master signifier or a leader, or see it as corrupting that even in the Occupy movement it takes on some kind of form and norms that people must subscribe to, then it seems that we must also dare the kind of leap of faith in trusting that there is an ethical relation that actually can flourish without these. And oftentimes it seems that we are trying to do both. In a way, both believing that there is an anarchistic mode of life in which this ethical relation can flourish, but we don't trust it enough to actually go for it. And sometimes I feel that tension haunting the discussions on political imagination and what we can see in the future. And that's why I wonder how you see the function of Levinas in this discussion of assembly, and in general, this tension between believing that there is something prior to all these structures that we are trained to disassemble. Yeah.
Thank you, Carl Egeman. Let's see. Why don't we come back to you, Robin?
Okay, thanks. I'll just limit myself maybe to one thing. So I mean, just to come back to Jack's point. I mean, for me at least, I think this aspect about the performativity of protest and the way in which assemblies, in a way, would be completely misunderstood if you would only look at them through, let's say what they're claiming or what their outcome orientation is or whatever. I think that's really, something that we all took for granted, or that we sort of accepted anyway, in a way, as the strongest point of the book, I think. And one that I think especially these movements that Butler's talking about, especially powerfully so demonstrate that, even, I mean, and in the case of the Occupy movement, but also in the case of the Gezi movement, this was even part of the self-understanding of the movement and its refusal to articulate a particular set of demands or follow the usual script, etc. But the other point is even more important, I think, namely this idea of, let's say, querying political struggles or movements. And in a way, that is what I wanted to express with this idea of the counter-hegemonic, because I think it would be precisely getting, in a way, rid of this querying moment if you would conceptualize these movements as just making another claim to hegemony and just wanting to replace one homogeneous we, which didn't really work for a lot of people, with another one, because that would have the same problems, follow the same logic. And I take it that in her earlier discussion with Laclau in Hegemony Contingency Universality, that was precisely one of the motivations to say that really chain of equivalence doesn't sound very appealing to when you look at it from a queer perspective. I mean, that's precisely not what you want to be. One node in the chain of equivalence, right? And that's a very powerful point, I think, one that we shouldn't, in a way, lose out of sight, because I think it was very explicitly there in a lot of the movements. I totally agree with your. I haven't seen the film, but from my involvement in the Gezi movement and from following people who have, in a way, I mean, this just as a kind of remark on the side. I mean, I'm less optimistic about the energy of the movement still animating those who remain. I mean, most people I know are terribly depressed and don't, and the email groups are usually going down in infighting and sort of political fragmentation. It's very difficult to see any positive dynamics that at work there. But of course, one should never exclude that it comes back. But if we go back to the moment of Gezi itself, I mean, one of the most commented upon, but also still, I think, most fascinating moments was precisely this way in which there were alliances between the most unlikely groups and agents, let's say, so that trans activists would, together with football hooligans, because both of these groups knew most about how the police operates, lead the rest of the protesters, which, if you would have asked them 2 days before, would you ever associate with any of these groups, football hooligans or trans activists, they would have been very clear that they would not, obviously, but then they, in a way, in that moment, precisely had to go through the learning process. And it was one not only of tactics, but really also of self-understanding. So one of the also very interesting learning processes that I think you can see there is, there was a lot of discussion about the vocabulary of protest, and what I called attention to in my blog post, this attempt to avoid othering and the kind of us versus them logic. So especially women and trans activists would talk, for example, to the football hooligans and explain to them why certain slurs are maybe not the way to go in terms of confronting the police and making their claim. And it took a couple of days for them to find a level of communication about these things, but ultimately, not in all cases of course, but in many cases, people were able to learn and to, I'm not sure whether self-limitation would then be the right term, but self-transformation maybe would be more adequate to say, it's a valid point, we have to think about ways of making our political claims in a different way if we don't want to fall back into, what the Turkish state has done for over 90 years, playing one group against the other and shifting alliances, and in the end always ending up in the same shitty violent logic. So I think that's a very important point, and precisely something I think that, if there's something to learn from this moment, it would be how do you preserve that moment of, well, queering would be one way to call it, and not sort of embed it again in the same kind of logic that has failed so many times before.
Thanks, Robin. You, Joshua, you're ready to go with an image and some thoughts.
Yeah, I didn't plan to have images, but the internet's amazing, whatever. I guess I want to push back in a comradely way against Jack's idea that violence is masculinist. It's a long-standing debate. It's certainly not my experience. It's interesting that it's identified that way often, and I actually want to return to a different text by Judy, one to which I'm less sympathetic. I don't know if it was clear, but there's things about the text I try to indicate in the blog, my blog post especially, that I'm very sympathetic to. She wrote a text about the shutdown of a Milo Yiannopoulos, or Milo, I guess his name is pronounced, a shutdown of a talk by him on February 1st, 2017 at UC Berkeley, which this is an image from. They were quite hostile to the way that it was shut down, took it to be violent, etc. Correctly, I think, and described Black Bloc, which was the tactic that was used, as being able-bodied white men, which is astonishingly wrong. I can tell you that from having been part of it. But I can also tell you that because a bunch of them were there with shields that said trans rights are good and pure, and were in fact trans dykes. And we're part of that black bloc, right? As is, in the Bay Area at least, always the case. And if we accept that was violence and bracket the question of what we count as violence, the idea that violence was masculinist, I think is wrong, probably 3, 4, 5 different ways. It was clearly against a certain kind of masculinism, among other things. And I would say the majority of its participants were not male-bodied or self-identifying as men. So, and that concurs or commensurates with a lot of my other similar experiences. So I sort of want to push back against that in half agreement, which is to say the idea that we want a queer perspective, and particularly a trans perspective on this is exactly right. And that, I think, is, among other things, one of the bravura moments in the book. Right? The book goes through a series of looking at a particular Judy insists that they're not identities, but subject groups, and then tries to see how those bounded groups are co-implicated or interdependent with groups who are maybe present, maybe not present, and so on. And begins, the first example is trans people. And that accounting, I think, is actually quite remarkable about exactly what we've discussed, the sort of the knowledge attendant to the precarity and vulnerability of being a trans person on the street as a kind of knowledge that imbricates that always already political activity with politics elsewhere. And so the move from that, which is like this politics can't be reduced to identity and it can't be reduced to a subcategory. It is not universal, but something that allows us to overcome the particular versus universalist opposition. Spectacular. And so I really want to sort of underscore that and its significance while being very hesitant to imagine that that has some logical relation to the claims around violence and nonviolence, logical or historical or practical, which I just don't think it does. That said, I have to now feel bad about that intervention because I'm well aware that while violence itself may not be a political trap, debating violence and nonviolence is clearly a trap, which I'm just playing into now. So I apologize.
Marianne?
I guess I would say that just because people who identify as women or as trans or as dykes, can commit violent acts doesn't mean that violence in the larger sense in which Jack invoked it and in which Judith discusses it in the book is not masculinist. And I think she's very clear about some of the gendering of these terms. And I tried to raise that in my blog post, and I tried to raise it tonight by saying, there are those of us who acknowledge vulnerabilities, and then the defensiveness against it, and the shields and the walls and the borders and boundaries. I mean, these are very gendered practices, traditionally gendered practices. And I think the question that Jack raises is so important because it's how do we dislodge these normativities? And I think that's where humor and some of these humorous performances or the things that go against the grain or the aesthetic, I mean, there must be ways to dislodge politics as usual, democracy as usual, and all of these things that have gotten us so profoundly depressed and the failures. Now, yes, there will always be infighting within groups. There's no question about that, and that's why I really like Nikita's evocation of those last days when there were different groups occupying different parts of the square who don't feel that they absolutely have to reach consensus, because as soon as you feel you have to reach consensus, then you get the governmentality of the new group. So I'm wondering in this whole discussion, does the we the people have to be one hegemonic group, or is there a way to invoke many different we's? We's that are strategic, that are forms of encounter that work maybe for 11 minutes or for a long time, but that don't necessarily have to practice coalition, but could agree to have diversity within the claims that are being made, and there could be multiple claims. And I think we've seen that And the reason that these movements of the early parts of our decade have been so inspiring is because I think they were trying to practice that kind of politics. Hasn't necessarily, hasn't lasted in the way that we would want it to last. But I think the reason to go back to this book and to those moments is because of what they seem to make possible.
Or I wonder if we can just get rid of the we the peoples, we's the peoples, that whole thing completely.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's part of the
think
old
about it
language
through
that we need to
some
dislodge,
different-
right?
Yeah, right, that's true. Nandini, you have come from the farthest. You've come from Delhi, so we're going to give you the last word and as much time as you want to regale us with your final thoughts.
Well, I'm just sort of flaking out a bit because of jet lag, but so Marianne has addressed my vulnerability by giving me a candy too.
To heal the body.
So just, in terms of this question about how bodies learn things and how our vulnerability is something that predates our individuation, which Butler talks about, and I'm going to quote something from her where she says, this is on page 39, she says, "To be a subject at all requires first finding one's way with certain norms that govern recognition. Norms we never chose and that found their way to us and enveloped us with their structuring and animating cultural power." And I think that's where that combination of both learning how to be a certain kind of body and at the same time when you slip up in reiterating that cultural norm, when you fail to perform it in the way that it's meant to be performed, opens that space for vulnerability where you're actually open to other ways of being. And I think it's both that combination of learning and yet dislearning what you've learned at certain crucial moments that allows you both to be a disciplined body and yet open to other people. And so that's where the hope that even somebody who's a bigot, who's learned to be a bigot over a long period of time through certain family relations, through certain histories, yet when they see somebody in pain might somehow feel that pain. And so I was reminded of Wittgenstein saying, when I see a man in pain, I cannot doubt his pain. So on the one hand, you assume that there is a body that you're responding to. On the other hand, you need a language with which to access that pain. And sometimes you have that language and sometimes you don't. And it's that moment which decides whether you have it or you don't have it. And I think part of that whole space of ethical responsibility is trying to overcome our everyday learning of how to be what we are and open ourselves to other people. And it's that hope that other people might respond in the same way that makes you assemble even when you know that the people on the other side are assembling against you. So I don't know if that kind of addresses the questions that you were raising, but I'm not sure that I've really been able to.
Both. I'm not sure if I have time to solve now.
We have a minute. You want to? Or we could leave it at that, which was a beautiful thing. So let's leave it at that and thank our guests, and then continue the conversation offline. All right, thank you so much.